week 13 and the final week of research and information skills. Before saying anything else, I'd like to congratulate all those students who got through, both in terms of distance and attending. Well done. Need more be said in that sense. Overall, I hope you all had a positive experience and you've learnt something along the way. From my perspective, it's been interesting. There's been an introduction of a whole lot of new material that had to be created for this particular unit. And I'm hoping that I was not too tardy in actually giving you the material on time. I mean, I know there was a delay for maybe a couple of weeks, and that was for obvious reasons. When you create new material for a unit, you've more or less got to obviously compile the work itself and trial it, get other people's opinions, and generally make sure that it's kind of fit for purpose in that sense. And these processes are fairly slow, at least from my perspective, because I like to try and get things right. Anyway, I apologise for any delays or inconveniences that you may have incurred during the unit. But anyway, like I said, getting back to the point, thank you for suffering all these things and getting through the unit. It's great. Truly congratulations. Now, in the briefest possible terms, I want to go over each of the weeks that we've been through and just do a very brief review. At this stage of the semester, I think it's good to reacquaint yourself with the parts of the journey that you've been through, if for nothing else, just to reinforce and to help, I guess, keep in your memory what's happened. Obviously, there'll be things or different things for each of you, so you'll take different aspects of the unit away with you, and hopefully you can use those when you do a degree. I'd be surprised if you can't. So without ado, let's look at week 1. What did we do in week 1? Essentially, it was an overview of the unit itself, and looking at things like, what information you'd need at university, how you might find information, and obviously that was the beginning of the rather long semester mantra about using the UTAS library. Hopefully you've kind of found that of use. I think probably the most important thing was the point of critical evaluation and how to evaluate information. At least I certainly indicated in week 3. That didn't come to pass till week 4, but at least we're starting to look at the ideas that we should be evaluating information before we use them. And then I touched on using the information that we get effectively in assignments and so on. However, like I said, we did all these things in a very general way, and it was obviously done in the subsequent weeks much more specifically and thoroughly. In week 2, we looked at the roles and limits of Google and Wikipedia, and again started to lean towards the UTAS library, but particularly the mega search option and the refinements that were connected with that, looking at journals, etc., and books. And also started to look at things like searching and scoping, which again we would pick up in the weeks to come. If nothing else, at least from my perspective, I wanted to, I guess, shift your awareness or your consciousness away from things like Google and Wikipedia to look far more thoroughly, systematically at gathering information, and hopefully at least you have some ideas now about why things like Google and Wikipedia are limited, particularly for university students. In week 3, we started to look at broader things like how and why do you record information. We started to look at different types of academic literature. And I think this is important, we looked at academic integrity, why we need to acknowledge people, started to look at the basic mechanics of referencing, like using bibliographies and reference lists, and we also did an exercise using a bibliographic record sheet. If nothing else, that was to get you into the habit of recording information wherever you find it, so you can always go back and give those people credit for what they've done. And I can't emphasise that enough, and I'm a strong believer and advocate of being honest in all situations, but particularly with things like ideas. People have spent a lot of time producing different I guess aspects of their work, and they should be credited for that. I think we would expect that from anyone else who was using our work. Then it's only natural, it's a natural fit to expect the same when you take other people's ideas. So I'm hoping, like I said, that message got through. In week 4, we looked at how to find information for university. We looked at the nature of objective and subjective information, primary and secondary sources, really we only touched on those. The most important thing that we looked at and considered was the reliability tests. And I'm hoping all of you have kind of au fait with those things now and actually apply them when you're looking at material. But I personally feel that week 4 is probably one of the most important weeks in the whole semester. It's the beginning of a critical process of evaluating sources, from which we can then know whether we can use that information or not, whether the evidence is appropriate, whether it supports a particular position and so on. And to me, that's important, particularly at university, but even in our everyday life. Now, week 5, we started to look at search options. And again, we tended to lean towards the UTAS library, but we started to look at things like Boolean search terms, etc., and how we can adjust or adapt the terms that we use to get different results. Again, I think a fairly important thing in terms of study. Week 6 was, I guess, perhaps a little bit indulgent, but it was more about how do academics operate. So what's their practice? And so we looked at how do academics converse in print, and we looked at the question and answer process in academia, academic debate, and how we build knowledge from those debates. Week 7 for me was probably a far more practical arm of what we're trying to do in this particular unit, and looking at, okay, how do we look at not only question analysis, but how to develop some sort of strategy for getting information. And again, like week 4, to me, week 7 is pretty crucial. How do we take a question, a simple question, and then try and find out the information to actually fulfill an answer to that question? Not necessarily an easy task sometimes, but if you do develop a strategy, you'll be far more efficient in finding what you need to answer the question. So hopefully, like I said, you're not wasting time on assignments. Week 8 was looking at things like the relevance of information. And again, we looked at unpacking essay questions, looking at specifically developing research plans or a plan to find an answer for a particular thing, and then going through the process of conducting a literature review. So when we're actually making a sweep of all the information available for a particular problem, and obviously we're cutting back to getting an answer here for an essay question or any other sort of assessment we may have. Week 9, we started to look at the research cycle, and to me this is kind of a fairly interesting process, and kind of in line with week 4, week 7. Week 9 was kind of, to me, a sort of culminating point where we actually start to look at an assignment question. We then unpack that question, and in this case we frame it and possibly reframe it to suit an answer that we're trying to direct towards the overall answer. And remember, we're not necessarily changing the question here, although we modify it to some extent within our sort of, I guess, our conscious decision making in terms of creating an answer. But anyway, getting back to the point, we go through this whole process, and I think planning is extremely important. And I've said, perhaps in these recordings, that planning for me, particularly with essay writing or any other writing that I have to do, generally follows a similar line, that rather than having a formal plan, I'll write a frame of ideas down, so bullet points, etc., and literally write from those, or at least flesh those out on the page. So I've always got the kind of working ideas on a page which need some sort of qualification, they need support, they need evidence, and I slowly draw in the material I've got from doing research to fulfill that fleshing out process. Now, week 10 looked at critical reading, and we began to examine the notion of reading itself, and looked at what is it to be a critical reader. So how do we have a dialogue with an author? For instance, we start asking questions. We're not only reading text, but we're actually almost interacting with that text, and we are, certainly in a cognitive sense. And for me, like I said, that's an important process of reading, because certainly when we're younger, we don't get to be critical about the text that we're reading. In week 11 was a kind of an unusual sort of week, in the sense that there wasn't too much formal work. A lot of it was to do with looking at research in motion. So how do we go from answers to a question that seemed to fit for a little while, or maybe without further questioning or without further evidence, are accepted, and then over time, maybe through questioning or through doubts, that the evidence for that particular thing begins to unravel, perhaps, and then through inquiry we decide that perhaps the original answer to a question wasn't right, and we begin to do more research to find out, what is a more acceptable or plausible answer. And I simply ask, is there ever a definitive answer to any question really? And I suspect there is, but things change, and change is okay. Now, week 12 is about big ideas. For me, we're looking at things like, how does information become knowledge? So what is it in that whole process where information can literally be kind of bland statistics, but how do we take that then and turn that into a kind of a process which informs and even shapes behaviour? It shapes things like legislation in terms of the government. It shapes our beliefs about things. And knowledge over time is something that we build. Anyway, I'll let you sort of ponder these things. I don't want to talk too much. It's the final part of the semester. Anyway, without saying more, congratulations again for finishing. It's been great working with you. Thanks for the feedback for some of those who've sent in emails and so on. It's been really good working with you all. And really have a great future and enjoy your studies. Seriously, enjoy your studies. And if nothing else, be a curious human being. Find out everything you can, because if it changes you, it'll change the world. Anyway, have a great life. Thanks.